On this edition of Primetime Politics,
we're going to need to continue to challenge China on human rights.
Canada has a new ambassador to China, but do we have a new China policy?
The travel industry really played no more of a significant threat than other industries within our community.
A medical assessment says Canada's vaccine mandates for international travelers was ineffective and unnecessary, just as the government is set to let the mandates expire. And our journalists will be in to weigh in on Pierre Poilievre's first week in Parliament as leader of the official opposition. But we start with the announcement of a new Canadian ambassador to China, Jennifer May. She is a veteran career diplomat who speaks 5 languages, including Mandarin. She was previously ambassador to Brazil, and she has been posted to Hong Kong and Beijing. Her appointment comes almost a year after the release by China of 2 Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, falsely imprisoned as alleged spies. Prime Minister Trudeau made the announcement on Friday, and he was asked about Ambassador May's appointment later when he was hosting a visit to Ottawa by the President of South Korea.
China is certainly a real challenging actor in the region. There are areas in which we're going to have to figure out how to work together, like on climate change. There are areas in which we're going to be directly competitive in many economic and trade issues. But there are areas in which we're going to need to continue to challenge China on human rights, on respect for the international rules-based order, and doing that with a nuanced approach that is looking out for the interests of Canadians, the interests of citizens across our democracies, is essential. I think for too long, China and other autocracies have been able to play off neighbors and friends against each other.
Joining me now to discuss the appointment of Jennifer May as Canada's new ambassador to China and what it might mean for Canada-China relations is Guy Saint-Jacques. Mr. Saint-Jacques is a former Canadian ambassador to Beijing. Mr. Saint-Jacques, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, first of all, your response to the appointment of Jennifer May, a career diplomat, to Beijing. The 2 previous ambassadors appointed by Prime Minister Trudeau, Dominic Barton, and before him, John McCallum, they had been political appointees. What do you make of this appointment?
Well, I think it's the right choice at the right time. I know that Mr. Trudeau and Mrs. Joly had looked for another political appointee. I know that they were hoping to get a woman with the right set of competencies, but they probably came to the conclusion sometime in late spring that they would be better served at this stage with a career diplomat. And among female diplomats in Global Affairs Canada, we had a group of 4 or 5 women that could meet the criteria, but I think that Jennifer May was the most qualified. When you look at her work experience, she has served in China previously. She speaks Mandarin, and she has served in Thailand, where she did trade work. She has worked in Vienna, in Germany, in Hong Kong, and her last appointment was as ambassador to Brazil, which is a very important function. So I think that she has well-rounded experience. She knows the Chinese, she knows the system, how the government works, how the Communist Party of China work, and I think that although she will be faced with a difficult task at this stage of the relationship, I think she is a very good choice.
Okay, well, let's explore that. Do you think her appointment in any way signifies a change in approach and in the way Canada is going to be approaching China?
Well, I would hope that you know, the Prime Minister realized that he has some very talented and competent people in the Foreign Service. And I would argue that the government in Canada are better served by appointing people who know the country where they are assigned and who can interpret developments for Ottawa and help Ottawa to establish its priorities, establish its policies. There are some regions in the world where it's more appropriate. In my view, it's essential to assign career diplomats. Of course, in a place like Washington or London or Paris, we have had a number of political appointees in the past, and I think some of them have done a good job. But when you look at diplomacy, it can be a difficult job, especially in modern time as things are evolving very rapidly. But what a career diplomat can bring is the capacity, the ability to network, and that's, I think, what Mrs. May will do when she arrives in Beijing.
Okay, well, let's look at that. You mentioned that this is a difficult job. It's not an easy job by any description in Beijing. The new ambassador, Ms. May, has told the Toronto Star already that she will raise human rights issues with China, like the treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority and the crackdown in Hong Kong. The Prime Minister said the same thing in his press release, announcing her, saying that he counts on her to raise human rights issues. But the ambassador says she also wants to, quote, repair the Canada-China relationship. Your reaction? Can you do both of those?
Well, I think that's why I say she is faced with a very challenging and difficult task. And it won't be easy for her. When I look at how Beijing operates now, access has become a lot more difficult. To give you an example, the American ambassador, who is, of course, a very senior guy, Nicola Burns, it's difficult for him to meet anyone above the level of Director General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in the case of Canada-China relations, the Chinese ambassador in Ottawa, Chong Pei-hu, keeps repeating that Canada should learn the lessons from the Meng Wanzhou crisis. And it's clear that they consider us like a junior partner. Furthermore, China conducts a foreign policy that is a lot more aggressive, in your face. They don't listen well. So in this regard, I think that Mrs. May will want also to work with other ambassadors, especially Western ambassadors in Beijing, to try to develop common approaches to problems that we are all facing in the relationship with China, and try to come up with a common position and maybe make joint démarches.
Which raises the big question. The Trudeau government had been told by China hands for a long time, and it had been musing itself about bringing out a, quote, new China policy. We're hearing instead that this fall we may hear something just about a recalibration of Indo-Pacific relations. What do you make of what you're hearing? You're close to the diplomatic world. Are we likely to see any change in our approach to China? Have those ideas about rethinking our relationship just gone out the window?
Well, I think there's still a debate about how firm should we be with China and how tough should we be. On this, I have argued right from the start of the Meng Wanzhou crisis that the only language that China understands is firmness. And we have learned a lot on China in the last few years, how Xi Jinping has increased controls on freedom of speech, religious freedom, how he has cracked down on democracy in Hong Kong, how the situation is difficult in Tibet and Xinjiang. And for all those reasons, it's very difficult to hope to get back to where we were before the latest crisis. On the other hand, I think that Canada is well placed. Canada is well liked for all the development assistance that was carried out over a period of 30 years. The cooperation stopped in 2013. We sent over $1 billion. We helped China to develop its dairy industry. We helped China to create its Ministry of Environment. And this is an environment where Canada is well perceived, where I hope that China will understand that we should develop collaboration on that. The same applies to health and pandemics. So hopefully Mrs. May will be able to build up on that goodwill that still exists in some quarters of the Chinese government and try to make progress. And, it will be a long and arduous process, but I am confident that she will be able to do it.
Well, it sounds very much, and you make the point, it sounds as if she has her job cut out for her. Thank you very much, Monsieur Saint-Jacques. The Trudeau government is expected to let its controversial COVID-19 restrictions for international travelers expire next week. Those restrictions include the requirement to be double vaccinated and the possibility of random testing and the requirement to use the ArriveCan app to enter Canada. Canada's hard-hit tourism industry has been calling for the measures to be lifted for months, and today the industry released a medical assessment by a number of infectious disease experts who say that the border measures were of very little use in stopping the spread of the virus.
Traveling in an aircraft is probably one of the safest things you can do. One study estimated the risk to be 1 in 1.7 million being infected during air travel. Another study suggested that we see secondary cases in 0.5 to 1% of cases. That's lower than in many of our day-to-day activities that we do, like visiting a restaurant, going to the theater, or going to a gym. And as such, it remains a relatively rare or very rare occurrence when you look at the bigger picture.
Joining me now is Dr. Zain Chagla. He's an associate professor at McMaster University. He's also the co-director of infection control at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. Dr. Chagla, thanks for joining us.
No problem.
Okay, in a nutshell, because you've sent this message out there before, but with this further review of the literature, what are your conclusions basically about the efficacy, the efficiency of vaccine mandates for international travelers?
So, there's a few things here. Number one is, did vaccine and other mandates at the beginning of the pandemic, make a difference in terms of COVID transmission? Yes, absolutely. In that context, COVID came into Canada from international. But I think, as we entered the Omicron era, as we knew, vaccine efficacy was significantly hit, especially 2 doses of vaccine. Much of the usefulness of these measures really started falling off. Vaccinated travelers could effectively transmit COVID to their communities. And in fact, our initial Omicron response, many of those travelers who brought Omicron into Canada were vaccinated. The random testing, I think, was useful initially to take a look at variants and community transmission. But in the context, in our communities currently, testing isn't really that available other than rapid tests. Testing border entering individuals may not pick up people that are actively infectious, may pick up people that were infectious weeks and months ago. And we've gotten much better technology in terms of monitoring for variants of concern, like wastewater, like sequencing in our communities. And so, I think in the burden of all of this, we see that, these measures, particularly in the Omicron era, really aren't paying any dividends. They're inconveniencing travelers. There's better ways to invest that time in human resource and financial resource. And I think, again, the travel and tourism industry is one of the few industries that's still left behind while the rest of society is able to open and operate freely without any restrictions. So, again, it's important that we make sure that this industry has the benefit of following the science like many other industries in society.
Okay, so you're arguing that the double vaccination or the full vaccination requirement and testing should be eliminated. But when you mentioned random testing, some medical experts have said that random testing at the borders is important and shouldn't be scrapped because we could be confronted by a more virulent and more dangerous variant, and there's a need for some sort of monitoring system to be in place. And that random testing is something you shouldn't scrap because it could be very onerous to try and set it up again if we are faced with a new variant that's particularly dangerous. What do you make of that argument?
Absolutely. I mean, that is one of the reasons why I think the federal government has kept this along in a position to try to get more data and be open about it. I think, again, we have to think back to what happened when Omicron first arrived from Southern Africa. It came into Canada. By the time we figured it out and sequenced travelers and figured out they had Omicron, it was spreading in Canada. In fact, we probably missed the spread by a few weeks. Yeah. Same with the United States, again, with testing. They found cases, but there was community transmission of Omicron in the United States. And I think that really talks about this virus. By the time you figure out a new variant is emerging, it's already in your community.
So border random testing, you say, is not effective. The literature has shown that it's not effective as a barrier.
No, exactly. And especially as we're testing only random individuals, there's lots of individuals coming through. It doesn't, if I develop symptoms the day after I come in through the border, I can't really test in my community. And so, again, there's a lot of holes in the Swiss cheese here in terms of preventing variants. There's lots of ways we can leverage current technology, though, to fill that role, right? Wastewater testing is a great advance, and it can be adapted to look for new variants of concern. It can actually be adapted to look for new pathogens and emerging infections. And so it is a great technology that we could develop even further to do passive surveillance to look for transmission. And similarly, the people that do need PCR testing in our communities, we can test them still, we can sequence them still, we can share that data globally. I can look up exactly what variants are circulating in the United States on the CDC website, and similarly as Canada, we should probably be, sequencing in our communities more to give the rest of the world, that information. Okay. This is going to be a global sharing network. It's not necessarily going to be just at the border.
Here's a question. When the majority of these measures for international travelers were brought in, they were rapidly imposed. I remember there was a big pressure around the Delta variant in certain countries, and then you mentioned the Omicron variants. Certain politicians were calling for them. They were pressuring the federal government, and I remember on the record, Doug Ford, Jason Kenney were definitely pressing the government to bring them in at airports. Did these airport measures, according to the literature, did they ever make sense?
I think Delta was an interesting period because of the fact that vaccine efficacy was much higher. And so you theoretically, like we had in many communities, proof of vaccination as a means to do higher risk activities, could have worked. Now, I would say, even on a flight, look, you had kids that couldn't be vaccinated, you had people with medical exemptions, you had probably people with waning vaccine efficacy, and so it wasn't as perfect as it could have been, but, there probably was benefits back in the Delta era. I think with Omicron, things really did change, though, and that really should have been recognized in that context.
Okay, last question, because we are running out of time. I want to ask you one thing, though. Masking. This is not going to be addressed from what we've been told by the federal government decision. Should masking still be mandatory on planes?
I think we need to align with the rest of society, and masking, is optional in the rest of society. We can go into incredibly high risk settings, like a Senators game, without a mask. An airplane is a well ventilated, well filtered space where people have to take their masks down temporarily to eat and drink. I think the need for masking, a mandatory masking on planes probably has outlived its effectiveness, particularly in the context of immunization and immunity. And if the federal government doesn't move on this now, there probably does need to be transparency in terms of when. There isn't a great indicator to say masks should stop. And recognizing that, that masks are not going to be a permanent intervention on flights. So, if it's not today, then when is it going to be? And that really has to be put out transparently.
Last question in 20 seconds. A lot of this is meant, so many of the presentations that you've made and your colleagues have made are also always referencing the high level of vaccination and immunity in the Canadian population. People are not that many people are going to get their booster doses. If you look at the percentage, for example, of fourth doses, could this all be thrown out the window? And should we have to revisit all of this if people let their immunity wane?
Again, we have natural immunity in the population too, which is playing a role. 60-70% of Canadians have had COVID. Boosters are great for high-risk individuals, and high-risk individuals that are traveling should be getting their booster shots particularly. But I think we are at a point now where the disease is fundamentally different amongst vaccinated individuals and immune individuals through infection, and we have to respect that as we move forward.
Okay, Dr. Chagla, thank you very much for taking the time.
No problem. All the best.
Joining me now are two members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Tonda MacCharles is a national political reporter for the Toronto Star, and Mia Rabson is a reporter with the Canadian Press. Both of you, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, let's start with, obviously it was the first week back of Parliament, and it was the first face-off between Pierre Poilievre as the leader of the official opposition and the Prime Minister and his government. I'll start with you, Mia. What did you make of it all and how it unfolded?
Well, maybe there was just too much excitement in the lead up to this sort of big showdown between the two of them. But to be honest, I found it a little bit boring. There was nothing exciting. There were no fireworks. Poilievre had his one-liners. He's known for being good with the zingers, and he pulled out a couple of them. But for the most part, it was just a par for the course question period. What I do find interesting was he brought all of the questions, whether it was with Trudeau on Thursday or right from out of the gates on Tuesday, he seemed to always start in French, which is to me sending some kind of signal. He's also got that caucus entirely focused on inflation, on affordability, on the economy. You almost heard nothing from them on anything else this week, even very little on some of their favorite topics of late, like the ArriveCan app or borders.
Yeah.
It's clear that is the message, that's the tone that he wants to strike, is all about the economy all of the time.
That's interesting you should make that point, because we were waiting for them to talk about the imminent departure of the ArriveCan and the vaccine mandates. Not a word of it that day that the story broke. Tonda, what did you make of this first week?
Well, look, I think that Mr. Poilievre had a pretty good week insofar as, he was able to keep his focus and his party's focus on inflation and the economy. But I think what we also saw, and this is worth noting, is that we saw a return to the usage of member statements, not for congratulating people and causes around the country, but for political statements to boost and amp up the message. So there's a return to that sort of Harper Days tactic in the House to focus on the message. Between Mr. Poilievre and Trudeau, look, always around Parliament Hill, on the days that people expect that it's going to be a big day, it's always anticlimactic. The dust-ups will come. And they'll come, though, on other times when each gets under the other's skin. And that will happen because while they both are, good on their feet in the House, they both have a pretty thin skin sometimes and make mistakes then. So I think we should watch for that. Otherwise, I also just want to mention that one of the things I found interesting watching Mr. Poilievre in the House, a couple of times this week he was shushing hecklers in his back bench saying, stop, and this is important when he was grilling Freeland on inflation. He wanted to hear the answer. And then I found him coaching some of his backbenchers on, replies and retorts to ministers' answers. So, he's very much his own communication strategist, and I think, he's a skilled one at that, and so it'll be an interesting dynamic in the weeks ahead.
Okay, well, there's a quote to retain. The dust-ups will come. Let's look at the other side of the equation. The government started off the sitting with announcing and tabling its first two pieces of legislation, were its what the Prime Minister is calling the affordability package, three measures, the temporary boost to the renters benefit, the Canada Housing Benefit, the 6-month doubling of the GST rebate, and the beginnings of the dental plan. What do you make, Mia, what do you make of how the government is responding on this issue, which will be this fall's issue, and that's affordability?
Well, in some ways it just was surprising at how long it took them to put something on the table. They've been sort of between the criticism on both sides, which is you're not doing enough, and don't do anything because it could make inflation worse. And it did seem to take them quite a while to land on where they were going to sit on some of this. Interesting as well that all three of the policies that they used are what the NDP had been pushing them to do, two of them from the NDP Liberal Supply Agreement. So nothing sort of new that just popped up over the summer, but they've just been taking their time trying to figure out what is the best way to respond, to give some people that need it the most a little bit of help without driving up inflation. Didn't stop the critics from saying you're going to just do that. You have the Conservatives coming up with alternative plans, although interestingly they are saying they will support at least the GST increase. It's not how they would do it, but it's a way to do it, and they will support it. So they also see a little bit of vulnerability if they didn't vote for that from their own.
Tonda, briefly, just on the government's response or the government's strategy so far on affordability.
Well, look, they have to do these things. These are key to retaining the NDP's support. And the fact is, this government still wants the NDP support to navigate this minority parliament, not just to put forward and pass progressive measures, but to avoid obstruction in committees. And I was told that very directly, they're going to cooperate, and they don't care if the NDP wants to claim credit for some of it. They're going to make sure that that deal sticks for the supply and confidence of the government for the months ahead. And most Liberals I talk to kind of see at least a 2-year runway before the next election, although the deal allows it to stay in place for 3.
Okay, well, while we have you on camera, Tonda, you had a chance to speak with Canada's new ambassador. You had an article on Jennifer May, the career diplomat who's now been named to Canada's new ambassador to China. Any words about, she's a career diplomat. What do you make of her selection?
So 30-year Foreign Service veteran. She is fluent in French, German, and Mandarin, although she says it's rusty. I asked her in Mandarin if she speaks Mandarin, and her reply was very swift and fluent, and I was impressed by that. She also has experience in Asia, so not just Hong Kong and Beijing, where she was responsible for the human rights monitoring at the embassy, also for the political trade portfolio while she was in Hong Kong. So she's got those under her belt. She's got a picture of what it's like to work under an authoritarian regime, because she's just fresh out of Brazil, where Bolsonaro is an authoritarian leader. And so she takes some lessons to that. But I think the signal for her, from her appointment by this government, is to try and put the relations on a professional diplomatic footing, as opposed to something that where we think that some ambassador has the political ear of the government. Look, the relationship is in the deep freeze. It has to get out of it. These are baby steps, but I think also the signal we're hearing from both her and the Prime Minister on Friday was they're going to raise human rights. They're not going to be shy about raising it. And it's going to be a lot more of a focus for the government. Yeah. So they need multilateral support to back them up on that, but that's what they intend to do.
Mia, what do you make of it? I mean, it's been a long time that, or recently, the government has been talking about a new approach, a new China policy, and now we're only hearing that it's just going to be some sort of recalibration of a Indo-Pacific policy. What do you make of this announcement and Canada-China relations as what we should watch for?
Well, a lot of people are making a lot of noise about the fact that she is not a political appointment. She's not, the first ambassador Trudeau appointed, of course, was one of his own cabinet ministers, John McCallum. Then he put in place Dominic Barton to try and deal with the two Michaels situation. And now he's going back to sort of a career diplomat, someone who might be able to take some of the posturing out of the relationship. But there's also those who might say this is a signal to China that they don't want someone who's that close to the Prime Minister in China, that they're not going to put someone like they would in Washington or in Germany or in France, some of Canada's allies. So there are definitely different signals that people are taking from this. Mm-hmm. I think for many people, just having someone in that ambassador's chair is what's important. This relationship has suffered dramatically over the last few years. It definitely needs some kind of reset. It needs to be warmed up, to go to what Tonda had talked about, it's quite a little bit chilly right now.
Deep freeze.
So it's a bit of a chance for Canada to sort of start a little bit fresh, put some fresh eyes with someone who has a lot of experience and knowledge about the region.
Okay, well, to both of you, thank you very much. We will watch this one especially with a lot of interest. I want to let you go, and thank you very much for taking your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Well, that's it for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Martin Stringer. Thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.